You're going to be upside down.
So for every player, the analysis has to be, if the check stops tomorrow, what do I do? So it's identifying the savings that you need to make. It's identifying the debt that you may need to manage. It means making critical decisions that will always end up making you stronger in this game.
Let's get one more round. Here we go.
My number one passion is football and my family. But what's your passion besides that?
4.
The Nflpa affords us a chance to go out and find what we're passionate about in the business world.
They offered internships. They offered to help guys finish getting their degrees. All of a sudden, I'll get to that later. But looking back, I should have taken advantage of that.
And that's kind of what I'm trying to look into this off season when I do attend the Harvard Business School.
We have to prepare. We have to stay unified. We have to act as men. And we have to make a decision of who this game is about.
Luther. Hey, ladies. See you. Have a seat. Thank you.
I've been meeting with a life coach.
How are you doing? Doing okay.
Who's helped to look at my talents and gifts and to figure out, okay, how are you going to be successful in what you do in life? You're not going to play forever. You could be the greatest today, but tomorrow you might be nothing. You might be out of the game. Hopefully with my story and with the potential of a lockout, it's going to help these guys to realize that, you know what, I need to take a time out. I need to slow down for a minute. I need to really look at where am I at. What could potentially happen in the future is going to affect myself and my family.
From the founding of the NFL in 1920 until 1993, when the Players Association first won real free agency and an equal role with the commissioner in deciding on issues affecting players, NFL players had almost no bargaining power with the owners except for brief periods when a rival league was bidding for them. Competition from the All-America Football Conference in the 1940s, from the American Football League in the early 60s, from the World Football League for 2 years in the mid-70s, and from the United States Football League for 3 years in the mid-80s, each time forced NFL owners to increase their players' salaries or risk losing them to the rival league. But as soon as the other league collapsed or was merged with the NFL, salaries flattened out again, and NFL players had to take whatever the owners were willing to offer. This situation did not change until 1993. But it took almost 40 years of bitter labor conflict to get there. NFL players first organized in the late 1950s over some basic demands that seem ridiculously meager today. A minimum salary of $5,000, per diem in training camp for the first time, some minimal protection in case of injuries. As basic as these demands seem, the owners refused to recognize the union until the courts forced them to. The fundamental issue for the owners then, like now, was control. They were the owners, and they fought against any attempt to make them share control with mere players. And Congress had to help them with an antitrust exemption for the mergers that eliminated competition for players. The players nearly called a strike during training camp in 1970 over the owners' failure to meet their financial obligations. That one was avoided, but not in 1974, which saw the first of 3 major strikes or lockouts, all of which the players lost, but which eventually led to free agency and the other benefits that the players finally won in 1993. In 1974, there was a 44-day strike during training camp. The players asked for increases in benefits and the minimum salary, a whopping $12,000 for rookies and $13,000 for veterans. But the major conflict was over what were called freedom issues, some basic employment rights, such as mutually binding contracts, and a challenge to the absolute power of a commissioner paid by the owners in ruling on player grievances and compensation for clubs if a player tried to change teams. These rights are so basic and so taken for granted today that it's hard to believe that players haven't always had them. In 1982, a 57-day lockout by the owners was the first during the regular season, and it canceled 8 games. The chief issue this time was the union's demand for a percentage of league revenues that, in addition to raising salaries, would have made the Players Association a partner with the NFL in running league business. The owners, of course, would not even consider that. In 1987, players struck for 24 days, affecting 3 regular season games. This time, the owners didn't cancel the games but put together teams of so-called replacement players, a nicer term than scabs, along with the NFL players who crossed the picket lines. The primary issue for the players this time was free agency, while the owners actually demanded a reduction in the current levels of compensation that had risen due to competition from the USFL. In all 3 of these major conflicts, there were hardliners and moderates among the owners. But the NFL always stacked its bargaining team with hardliners, and during the strikes, all owners are ultimately owners. In 1974, for instance, the hardest of the hardliners included the Giants' Wellington Mara and the Bears' George Halas. Mara later became regarded as one of the grand old men of the NFL, a father figure to Giants players. But in the 60s and 70s, he was fiercely anti-union, and the Giants were notorious for cutting their player reps, even when there wasn't a strike. Halas was even less subtle about his anti-union sentiments. After he cut the team's player rep and most vocal strikers at the end of the 1974 strike, Halas boasted to reporters, "It's the greatest bleeping thing that's happened to the Bears in 5 years. We got rid of some of these malcontents. Great day." Altogether, in 1974, 7 player reps and all 4 union officers were cut, traded, or placed on injured reserve against their will during or after the strike. And the owner's basic attitude hadn't changed by 1987. Tex Schramm, the general manager of the Dallas Cowboys, who led the NFL's bargaining team in '87, made a statement to Gene Upshaw that summarized the owner's attitude toward players over this entire period. "We're the ranchers," Schramm told Upshaw. "You're the cattle." All 3 of the strikes or lockout were costly to both owners and players, but also to the popularity of the NFL, alienating fans who mostly blamed the players for being greedy. The owners won each time for 4 main reasons: their enormously greater financial resources, their control of the media, their ability to stay on message while players told reporters whatever was bothering them, and the players' lack of solidarity, in stark contrast to the Major League Baseball Players Union. In 1974, between a quarter and a third of the players crossed the picket lines over the 44 days of the strike. In 1982, no players crossed because the owners locked them out, but there were bitter divisions within the union that undermined the players' position. And in 1987, 261 out of 1,600 players crossed the picket lines, including some of the league's biggest stars. The players have had many strong leaders going back to the 1960s. Guys like Bernie Parrish and John Gordy in the 60s, John Mackey and Ed Garvey in the 70s, Marvin Powell and Gene Upshaw in the 80s and 90s. Mackey, Powell, Kermit Alexander, Freeman McNeil, and Reggie White put their names on the lawsuits that eventually won free agency and a fair share of league revenues for all players. But the strikes and lockout, particularly the strikes of 74 and 87, tested every player in the NFL. With labor peace since 1987, it's hard to imagine how ugly the strikes of 1974 and 1987 were. Players who crossed the picket lines were not just saving their own paychecks, but stealing from their striking teammates, and the guys who stayed out despised the ones that went in. The strike simply tore teams apart. Guys who crossed the picket line used lots of different reasons to justify their actions. The Baltimore Colts middle linebacker Mike Curtis has the unfortunate distinction of being the first scab in NFL history. Curtis told reporters that he was already being paid more than he was worth, and he accused the union of greed. Some players said that they were grateful for whatever the owners gave them. Some couldn't imagine what they would do if they didn't play football. Several players in 1974 defended their right as American citizens to make a personal decision, as if it had no impact on their teammates or the rest of the players who remained on strike. The Cowboys' John Nyland told reporters that he prayed over his decision to cross the picket lines, and he quoted scriptures from Ephesians, Colossians, and Timothy commanding slaves to be obedient to their masters. There were lots of ugly incidents during the 1974 strike. Eagles quarterback Roman Gabriel flipping off his teammates who screamed at him as he drove past their